In Lightroom's print module, you have the option of sharpening, low, standard, high. Do you recommend using this? And if so, is it trial and error? Lightroom's print module also has sliders for brightness and contrast. Do you recommend using them? Is there a benefit printing from Photoshop than from Lightroom?
All right, the three-part question. So is there a benefit printing from Photoshop versus Lightroom? No, they use the same software, the same color management module. They're supposed to be identical. So whichever paper you prefer, go for it. Or sorry, whichever program you prefer, go for it. A brightness and contrast sliders. I prefer to do all my image editing, in the image itself and not make one-off changes for the print, especially because if you adjust those brightness contrast sliders in the print module, I'm not 100% sure if it saves that. So if you come back a week later or a month later and you want to make that print again, and those have been reset, then you're not going to know exactly what your settings were. Whereas if you edit specifically the image, then your changes are effectively saved and you can print that at any time with the same settings. And then the first part was print sharpening. So I don't print a lot from Lightroom, and what I do print is pretty small. Print sharpening is one of those things that the larger your print, the more important it is. So my guess is that up to an 8x10 at least, you'll probably see little or no difference in what you set the print sharpening to. Above that, it might start to make a difference. I'm guessing there are better resources online than me for people who have tested that and have posted results. But for all the prints I've made from Lightroom, I just leave it at whatever Lightroom wants to do, kind of standard, and go from there. So I know that's not a huge amount of help, but let it decide the sharpening. Don't use the sliders, and Photoshop or Lightroom equal for printing.
Great. So the next question is, I have 3 options for printing on my new Canon Pro 300 printer: Lightroom print module, Photoshop, Canon professional layout, and print. What are the major differences? What are the advantages of one over the other?
Got it. So nice little segue from our last one. Lightroom versus Photoshop should be pretty much exactly the same. I can't think of any real practical difference between the two. Canon's Print Studio Pro, well, what was Print Studio Pro that's now Professional Print and Layout, it basically collects all of the settings into one window. So if you're printing from Photoshop or Lightroom, you do the Photoshop print settings, and then you go to the printer settings and you choose your media setting and your quality and that sort of thing. And those two work together. When you're using Professional Print and Layout, number one, all those settings are on one screen. Secondary, Professional Print and Layout was built to be on a RIP software platform, which just means that the Professional Print and Layout bypasses the Adobe color management module or the Apple or the Windows color management. It's just in Professional Print and Layout, and that talks directly to the printer. So it does then function independent of the other software, which is kind of nice. And it's also a useful tool if you're trying to root out some maybe color discrepancies when you're making prints, whether that's, software or some other piece. And lastly, Professional Print and Layout does let you do, say, many images on a roll if you're using a larger printer. So in the Pro 300, I would say it's mostly a matter of what you're comfortable with and what fits your workflow the best. I don't know if there'll be noticeable quality differences between the three. I think they'll all print just about the same.
Great. And we have a question from Joyce, which we did get your email, Joyce. So we're going to actually send you a response via email because I think it is a little bit of a longer answer. Is that right, Evan?
Yes, I actually emailed Joyce right before we started. So hopefully she has that, and we can work on it from there.
Great. The next question, thinking of replacing my Canon Pro 9500 Mark II and wonder what Evan's thoughts were on inkjet versus dye-based printers. I use mostly Lasal exhibition luster, Juniper Baryta rag, and sometimes Entrada rag.
I always like a pigment printer for two main reasons. Number one, it will do a better job on matte or rag papers, and also the longevity is better. So pigment printer would be my number one advice. The dye printers these days are not there's not as big of a cost difference between the pigment and the dye printer. So you're not thinking you have to spend, say, twice as much to get a pigment printer. For Canon now, the Pro 200, Pixma Pro 200 is the dye, and the IPF Pro 300 is the pigment. Like I said, I think there's only a couple $100 difference between the two, or a little less. Both printers make stellar images, but again, getting the pigment ink will give you a better print on matte paper and better print longevity over time, because it's pigment versus dye. So that would always be my first choice, is to go for a pigment printer.
Does Moab make a textured paper for making greeting cards? They watched our video making the greeting cards, but prefer a textured paper.
Yeah, currently we don't have anything textured for cards. The one thing you could do is the Entrada rag textured. You could take that and cut it and score it to make your own cards. And one thing that you'll notice is on the back of the box, it will say grain short or grain long. I don't think I have a box close by to demonstrate that. But in the stamped item code on the back, it'll say GS or GL. And if they're 8.5, 11 sheets, you want that to be grain short, so that when you fold it, you're not folding across the grain. So no, we don't have an out-of-the-box solution for textured greeting cards. You could use the Entrada rag textured. The only downside is that it is coated just on the one side. So you wouldn't have great results printing on the inside, but you could absolutely print on the outside and then just handwrite your note on the inside of a custom-made card.
Great. I have a Canon Pro 100 printer and iMac desktop. How do you recommend color calibrating monitor and printers?
So you won't ever need to color calibrate the printer, because printers are a set value, and that's what the ICC profile does when you print with it. For a monitor calibrator, if you don't already have one, the X-Rite i1 Display Studio is a great tool. It's usually about $170 and will work really well with your iMac. If you plan on getting an external monitor, maybe an external photography monitor, you might want to get the i1 Display Pro, because that will do any monitor out there. But if you're just going to stick with the iMac, the i1 Display Studio will be a great calibrator. And then I know in our color management webinar, I give some of the metrics for that, but you want your brightness to be somewhere between 120 and 160 to match your print. And then there are some other gamma settings in there, and a patch chart size. So if you want those specific settings, view the color management webinar and jump to the monitor calibration part of it.
Should I use the advanced black and white in the Epson printer driver, or should I use an ICC profile for the paper?
So we actually went over that in depth in the black and white webinar from a week or two ago. So pull that up on YouTube, and that should be in the description. It's absolutely a personal preference point. I generally use the ICC profile because it knows the black and the white point of the paper, and I think it does a little better job adapting the tones in the image. But again, it's going to depend on your subject and your paper and what looks good to the print.
I'm combining digital printing and alternative processes. I want to use InkAid matte coating in sections of my print over a previous printed image on Moab paper. Do you have any experience with this?
I do not, but it sounds like a cool idea. I've not spoken with anyone that puts InkAid over an image that's already been printed. So that would be interesting to see what happens. I've only talked with folks that use it just on uncoated media to make their own inkjet paper. So I won't be much help, but like I said, it sounds like a cool project.
And if anyone knows anyone that does that, feel free to send them advice or send us advice, and it would be great to kind of know more about that. Do you like the Epson option for printing in black and white? The printer takes over in the profile selection.
Yep, so that's Epson's advanced black and white. So yes, we did just talk about that, and go back to our black and white printing webinar and check through those sections.
Should I color calibrate my MacBook Pro, or is the monitor not customizable enough?
You should absolutely calibrate any monitor that you're using, just because number one, you don't know the brightness reference for printing, and all monitors are different brightnesses. And especially when you're using a Mac, if you have the True Tone turned on, it'll be making the display brighter and darker and warmer and cooler all the time. So you'll want to turn that stuff off and calibrate it. And then second, you absolutely want to calibrate your monitor, because you don't actually know what colors the computer thinks that it's showing you. So that monitor calibrator reads all those color patches, reports back, and sets everything so that the orange, the yellow, the green on the screen that you're seeing is the actual color number value of what's in your file. So it doesn't matter what your display type is, you always want to calibrate it for sure.
And the second part to that question was, do photo papers have dynamic range?
So that's kind of a difference in terms. What photo papers do have is a white point and a black point. So in between those is what we would generally understand to be the dynamic range, or the range between the darkest tones and the lightest tones. As a rule, photo black papers, Baryta, luster, semi-gloss, glossy, are going to have a little wider sort of, that would be kind of contrast range if you're talking about printing, because a photo black paper will give you a little more detail in the shadows because it reflects more light. A matte paper is going to have a slightly smaller contrast ratio and also a slightly smaller gamut. So dynamic range is really something we reserve for the capture device, and then gamut and contrast range is what we would talk about for the output. So they sort of have a dynamic range, but it's a different thought than when you're talking about that in a camera.
I've seen some photographers making C-type prints. What is it? And does it give more brilliant colors?
I think that probably is referring to Cibachrome. And that was a certain set of dyes that were used in traditional color printing. So the best way to emulate a Cibachrome print is with a high gloss paper. And we don't really have traditional high gloss paper. The closest thing we have is the Slick Rock Pearl, which does give you kind of that 3D look. The base of the paper isn't a super bright white. It's sort of a medium bright white. So it will be a little different than a high gloss, but that's the paper I would start with if you're looking for that kind of highly saturated wet look in your prints, the metallic pearl.
I read that ABW no longer works with newer Mac OS. Can you confirm?
I don't know. That's a function of the print driver, so I can't imagine that they would remove it, but I haven't tested any of the new Apple software for compatibility yet.
Can you print on the same side twice?
You can. I think my first guess is that you want to do a test print and say do half of the paper and then turn it over and do the other half of the paper. That's 100% acceptable. You can also print over something you've already printed. Obviously, where the inks overlay, you might get some odd colors and things like that. But yeah, as far as I know, no issues in overprinting. I've certainly made that mistake a few times, and you have a little ghosted image below the image that you really wanted on the paper.
Just purchased the new 11x14 Juniper Baryta rag paper and realized my Canon Pro 9500 doesn't show that size. Is there a workaround?
There is a workaround. You can always make a custom paper size. So let's do that. So I'm going to do it from Photoshop on the Mac. PC is similar. So what we'll do is go to print. And then we'll do a Canon printer so that it's similar. So you do that in print settings. And then under paper size, you'll see that it is also not here. So below this US letter are all custom paper sizes that I've created. So at the bottom of the list, or if you don't have any custom paper sizes yet, you'll see this manage custom sizes. and that will bring up an option. So we're going to go ahead and make a new one with the plus button. And I'm going to call that 11 by 14. Now the trick is you always want the shorter edge to be the width, because when you're printing, no matter what the paper is, you're always feeding that shorter edge first into the printer. So the width is going to be 11. The height is going to be 14. The printer may or may not let you print borderless. So if you want to try and print borderless, you leave this non-printable area at user defined and you set it all to 0. But as you'll see, that will sometimes reset your values. So we have to put in 11 again, 11 by 14. So if I leave this at 0, it gives me two options. It may allow me to print borderless. That all depends on the print driver. But the other thing is it allows me to center my image because I know that I've set my margins to 0. Now, if you want to know the default margins of your printer, you'll select it. In this case, we're demoing on the Pro 100, but you would select your 9500. And it will automatically fill in the values, but you can see they are asymmetrical. So when you check the scale to fit media and center print in the Photoshop box, it will probably be just a little off because of those asymmetrical margins. Now, another thing to keep an eye on in Mac is when you select the printer for the margins, it will reset your values to the maximum paper size available for that printer. So again, you got to tell it, no, I really want 11 by 14, and then hit OK to save it. And now that we're back in the main print window, you'll see that under the default paper sizes is the 11 by 14 that you just made. So if we hit save, that should reflect it here in the Photoshop preview window. So hopefully that answers the question. And we do also talk about custom paper sizes in the recorded webinar we have on the greeting cards. And there, I think we go over custom paper size for both PC and Mac.
Great. Do you have any suggestions for types of images that work well with the Anasazi canvas? And do you have suggestions for post-work preparing to print? They print on the Epson 3880.
Well, let's see. So the first thing to know is the canvas obviously is matte. So if you've been doing a lot of image printing on Luster or Baryta, your canvas prints are going to look significantly different because it's a matte surface and it's also a very heavily textured surface. So because it's canvas, it's going to have just a little bit less detail. It's going to have less tones in the shadows. It's going to have a smaller overall gamut. So I think a couple things to test would be, especially if you want to go ahead and soft proof, look at perceptual versus relative colorimetric rendering and do a gamut warning and see what's in gamut or out of gamut for that file. And maybe some of the color disappointment you're seeing is because those colors are out of gamut and they're getting rendered differently than you would want them to be. What else? I think images with a good contrast range are going to show a little better on canvas than, say, something that's mostly midtones or with a lot of really compressed highlights, because you want that broader range to really render the differences between the lights and the darks. And then once that canvas print comes out of the printer, you're going to, if you have the space, let it off gas overnight, and then coat it with a protective spray so that before you stretch it, or rather coat it with a protective spray before you stretch it so that when you do, it's less likely to crack or separate the ink at all at the edges of the stretcher bars because you put that coating on it. And I would say if you have a very specific problem with the canvas or you're really struggling with something specific, shoot us an email and then we can kind of work on it one-to-one to get those images dialed in.
Do you have a preference between the Epson P800 or the Canon Pro 1000?
The P900 has now replaced the P800. And the big difference is that the 900 uses matte black and photo black simultaneously. So there's no more black ink swap on the Epson desktop printers, which we've been waiting for forever. So that also kind of closes the gap with the Canon printers. I think quality-wise, they're just about identical. Also, ink cost per milliliter between those two is almost the same. So it really boils down to Epson will allow you to do roll paper. Canon gives you that Print Studio Pro or professional print and layout software. And also Canon's support folks are located generally on the East Coast and have intimate knowledge of the printers. So if you're somebody that thinks you're probably going to want to contact tech support a couple of times, you'll generally get a more knowledgeable support person and a quicker response from Canon than you would from Epson. But other than that, it's going to boil down a lot to personal preference. And so I would say if you have a camera store close by, see what they offer. And if they have demo machines, go make a couple of test prints and kind of feel out what machine you like better. The other thing I like about the Canon is it has a much more simple and I think more reliable fine art media feed. Epson's still utilizing the front feed path, which can be kind of a challenge, whereas the Canon uses a rear single sheet feeder that has been pretty much flawless here for the thousands of pages we printed on our Pro 1000. So both very good printers. I really think it boils down to, is roll paper a deal breaker and what's your personal preference?
Can you explain the differences in rendering intent options, specifically relative colorimetric and perceptual for printing and proofing? Are there types of images or papers where one is preferred over the other?
Yes. So rendering intent takes the out of gamut colors and adapts them into the printable space so that we don't just get empty holes where our out of gamut colors are. And the difference between the two is that relative colorimetric only moves the out of gamut colors into the edge of the printable space, whereas perceptual shifts everything a little bit to keep the relationships between colors the same. So if you have an image with little or no out of gamut colors, relative colorimetric is going to give you the most screen accurate print because it's not changing the colors that are in gamut. If you have a lot of out of gamut colors, the one challenge with relative colorimetric is it can start to stack those colors up right at the edge of the printable space, and you can get some clipping or some harsh transitions between those out of gamut colors sometimes. Whereas perceptual is going to move everything and keep those relationships the same, so you'll have smooth tonal transitions. Now it's definitely going to depend, on a per image basis, and it's also going to depend on the paper because different papers have different gamuts. So a soft proof is going to be the best way to kind of pre-visualize what's going to happen. And let's look at that real quick.
And just a question to go along. Teresa's asking, how do you test gamut between perceptual and relative? If you can show that as well.
Yeah, so really the only way to sort of test it is to do a show gamut warning in your software. So let's do that. I have my image open in Photoshop. I'm going to go to the View menu, Proof Setup, and then Custom. And that will bring up the proof condition. So in Photoshop, device to simulate is really your print profile. So let's start with right here. Let's start with Juniper Baryta on the Epson P5000. So I'm going to select that, and I'm going to do relative colorimetric, and make sure if you're printing with relative colorimetric, you always check the box for black point compensation. And what that does is that adjusts your shadows, again, to be in gamut. If you leave black point compensation off, you're probably going to get a lot of really muddy shadow details because the software is just assuming you can print all the way to complete black, which we can't. So I've got my profile, I got my rendering intent, I've checked the preview box, and again, we're looking at this over Zoom, so it's not great. But as I turn this on and off, especially in those color patches in the lower center of the screen, you can see that there's some noticeable difference. So I'm going to leave preview on. Now your other options in here are simulate color and simulate black ink, simulate paper color. Now when it says simulate paper color, what it's doing is it's reading the paper white value out of the profile. I think simulate paper color has pretty limited application. I find it almost always really over exaggerates the paper. So I generally leave it off when I'm soft proofing. So I'm going to click OK here. And then as a second step, I'm going to go to View, and then Gamut Warning, which is the third option down. And that will render for me in hot pink exactly what colors are out of gamut. Now, Photoshop's default for gamut warning is a medium gray, but because there can be a lot of gray in an image, I went ahead and set mine to a color that is probably not going to be in any of my photos, so it really jumps out at me as to what is in gamut, what is out of gamut. So with gamut warning on, then we can take a look at proof setup custom again. We want to choose a different profile. So let's stick with the P5000 and let's look at, say, the Entrada Rag Natural on the P5000. And when I select this, it's going to change what's out of gamut. So you can see it's different colors that have now become out of gamut. Some have become in gamut, and that's just a function of how the paper works with the specific inks on that printer. So we're going to click OK, and then we can go back up to View and turn off gamut warning. And then the other thing we can do is going back to that proof setup custom, we can toggle between relative colorimetric and perceptual. And for me here, looking at this screen, the difference is pretty subtle. But again, depending on your image, what paper you're using, what printer you have, those differences may be more dramatic, or you may really not notice any difference. So it's workflow specific and it's image specific, and it's something that as you spend more time printing and you've used more papers, you'll have a better idea in your mind of how that paper is going to handle that image. But when you're starting out, absolutely spend some time in the soft proof, toggling through the options. And if there's a combination that you seem to really like, make a little note of that and put a post-it on your printer that says, hey, I like relative colorimetric for this paper, I like perceptual for that paper, or for all my portraits, I prefer these settings, because it's just building a workflow for yourself that complements the photos that you're taking.
What are the main differences or characteristics of printing on Entrada versus Lasal papers? How do the prints compare?
So there's two main different Lasal papers. We have the Photo Matte and the Exhibition Luster. So if we look at Entrada versus Photo Matte, the Entrada is going to have a little more surface texture to it, and it's probably going to have a slightly larger gamut and a little more detail in the shadows. If you're comparing Entrada to the Exhibition Luster, it's going to be significantly different because one is a matte cotton rag and one is a traditional luster paper. So the luster is going to have more apparent shadow detail, a larger gamut, and the colors are going to appear more vivid because that paper reflects a lot more light and holds the ink differently. But the best thing that you can do is get our sample box, 2 sheets of everything. They're all labeled. It's 24, 25 bucks, and print one image on 5, 6, 8 different papers, and then you'll really see how that image is transformed by the paper. So always my advice to get the sample box and spend an evening getting your papers dialed in. And then you also have a reference down the road when you're looking for a specific paper or you can't remember how something looked, open that up and here's your image on all these different papers to really illustrate how each one changes.
Is there any problem with printing wireless?
The only challenge you can have if you have your printer wirelessly on the network is if you live in a place that has a lot of wireless networks. Say you live in a condo in an apartment and all your neighbors have Wi-Fi networks. Sometimes that can cause some traffic confusion and some interference. And then possibly your printer will get halfway through a print and feel like it might have lost connection with the computer and just spit out the paper halfway through and say, well, sorry, I missed. But if you have a robust network and you're pretty confident in it, there shouldn't be any issue printing over hardwire network, wireless, or USB. You just kind of know that there's a problem if you get a couple of prints that come out, halfway done or 3/4 of the way done, but it doesn't finish the print job.
My Ezio, did I say that right? Ezio monitor?
Azo
monitor software calibrates to a 100C value brightness by default. Is that too low?
I'm guessing that's 100 candela per meter squared, so our standard measure of brightness. And it's only too low if it is darker than your prints. So although 160 is sort of the ISO standard, I use 120 here. That matches my prints really well. If in your environment a setting of 100 matches your prints, then there's absolutely no harm in using that. If you find it's a little dark for your purposes, move it up to 110 or 120, calibrate again and see if that's improved the output. But there's no, you must do this hard and fast value. There's just a brightness setting that lets you confidently print, knowing that your print's going to come out looking almost identical brightness to your monitor.
Do you recommend letting the printer or Photoshop control the color? And under what circumstances is each appropriate? What color profile reference standard do you recommend or prefer to use?
So if you're going to use one of our ICC profiles, you have to say application manages colors, whether it's Photoshop, Lightroom, Capture One, anything else. Printer manages colors you use if, say, you're using a paper made by your printer manufacturer, or if you want to use Epson's advanced black and white or Canon's black and white photo setting. In that case, you have to say printer manages colors because the print driver is making the black and white decisions. But aside from black and white, if you're using one of our papers, then you're always going to want to select application manages colors instead of printer manages colors, so you can use those ICC profiles. I think the second part of that was, what color profile reference standard do you recommend? I don't think there's really a color profile reference standard. If you're meaning color space of your image file when you're editing, that would be Adobe RGB or ProPhoto RGB. But then when you go to print, you're always going to use the output profile for whatever paper you're using. Hopefully that answers the question.
I have an Epson 3880 and an iMac 2017 computer. I've calibrated my system, but I find that my daytime images are spot on, but nighttime images are noticeably darker and muddy from what I see on my monitor. Any solutions?
Double check in your system preferences that true tone display is turned off and ambient light sensing is turned off, and make sure that when you did your monitor profile, you also told it not to adjust for ambient light, because it sounds like your computer is changing the display colors and or brightness in the evening, because they've generally enabled that by default, which is terrible if you're trying to do a color managed workflow. So probably that's the problem.
I have a Mac and a BenQ monitor. How do I calibrate the BenQ, and is this a waste of time? I use a Canon Pixma Pro 10 and have downloaded all the Moab profiles.
Calibrating your monitor is never a waste of time. So that BenQ, if it's one of their photography series monitors, that's the 99% Adobe RGB, that's where you're going to need that X-Rite i1 Display Pro. So you're going to have to take a step up from the Display Studio and go to the Display Pro. And then you'll use the BenQ software, and you also have to make sure to plug that monitor calibrator directly into the display and not into your computer, because with these hardware LUT monitors, Adobe RGB, the AZO, the NECs, the BenQ photography series, then you're doing actually the calibration in the display and not just with the video card on your computer. So that should do it. Yes, you want to calibrate it, and then you should have a perfect one-to-one match between what's on your screen and what you print.
Can you recommend a photo paper for an HP LaserJet printer? And are they able to use the paper ICC profiles with the LaserJet printer?
So with a laser printer, you can use pretty much any kind of office paper out there. You wouldn't use, say, a Moab paper because that's coded for inkjet, which makes it very difficult to use toner. Color profiles are going to be really hard to find because a laser printer is not meant for photo reproduction. So that's just kind of be a lot of kind of trial and error and testing. So find a paper with a finish that you like and give it a shot.
Evan, we get this question every time, and I think we don't have the answer.
Test image. I have a bookmark of it. Look at this. We can be efficient.
I was going to say, if we forgot this again. So
nope.
This question is about the test page that he was showing when he was sharing his screen and where they can find an image to do the test prints. So Evan will share the link to that test image.
That's going to panelists. Let's send it to everybody.
I'm so happy that you actually have it this time.
I could only spell. There we go.
I missed the calibration tool and profiling program you mentioned earlier for the iMac with Epson printers. Can you just repeat that?
Let's just go there really quick. If you have a data color spider or whatever else, no problem using those monitor profiles. We've worked with X-Rite for many years, and we use their products for our demos and for our ICC profiling and testing and that sort of thing. So that's just what has brought us to recommend the X-Rite products. They're bulletproof. They last a long time. They're real straightforward. Okay, so for a standard screen, your laptop, iMac, Windows all-in-one desktop, anything like that, you will get great results with the i1 Display Studio, which is this device right here. If you have one of the monitors we were talking about recently, an NEC or a BenQ with the 99% Adobe RGB, with those monitors, you're going to need to take one step up to the i1 Display Pro, which looks about the same as the Display Studio, but it gives you some more functions and has the ability to work directly with the hardware LUT in that monitor. So i1 Display Pro for photography monitors or Adobe RGB monitors, and then the i1 Display Studio for your standard laptop, desktop, iMac, all those other screens. And like I said, if you live in a city with a camera store, absolutely go buy it from them and build a relationship with those folks. And if you don't live in a city with a camera store, then obviously your favorite online vendor will absolutely have any monitor calibrator you're looking for.
Once you soft-proof, what do you do afterwards, and where do you fix the out-of-gamut image?
So that's the beauty of rendering intent, is you don't actually need to fix the out-of-gamut colors. And a lot of folks say, well, but don't I want it all in gamut? Well, not necessarily, because you're not able to go in and to just change that one color and kind of put it where it needs to go. You'll end up making global changes to your image and probably have some kind of unintended side effects. So really what the gamut warning is it shows you what colors will get translated a little bit, just as a heads up. And it's also a great tool if you printed an image and you say, well, what happened to the green grass or the purple in my sunset or whatever other color you're looking at, and you say, this isn't quite right. You can then go look at the soft proof and the gamut warning and see, oh yeah, that purple in the sunset is at a gamut. So what I'm getting out of my printer is the closest approximation to that. Now, if you've tried Relative Colormetric and you've tried Perceptual, and neither one gives you a print that you're happy with, then you can absolutely go in and do a selective color and change that purple to be closer to a color that you want. But the gamut warning is definitely not a red flag that says, hey, you have to go back and re-edit your image. It's just a mental note to say these colors will get changed a little bit or more noticeably when you print. And then once you make that test print, then you can decide if that's something that needs to be adjusted or if you're happy with how it came out. So definitely not a real workflow thing that says, hey, you have to change this before you print.
How large a file is needed to print a canvas 3.5 feet by 7.5 feet to avoid pixelation?
You're going to want to work with your print shop on that. I'm guessing you're not printing that at home, because the required resolution varies with the viewing distance. And the easiest example of this is if you're printing, say, an 8 by 10, you want it somewhere around 300 pixels an inch when you send that file to the printer. A billboard, for instance, which we view from hundreds of feet away, those are sometimes printed at 40 pixels an inch, right? Which up close is going to look terrible, but at a distance looks completely normal. So generally, a really large print, you can print at a somewhat lower resolution because we're not viewing it at a foot or 2 feet or 3 feet. We're viewing it at 6 feet or 10 feet. So if you're working with a print lab, I would 100% ask them what they recommend. Generally, I don't print any lower than about 180 pixels an inch, especially if we're doing 40 by 60 inch trade show images. But again, with those, people are walking right up to them to look at the paper and the inks and the tones. And so they're not really viewed at what would be an average viewing distance for a print of that size. So if your file can support it, 180 pixels an inch is great. You may be able to go lower, especially if you're using canvas, because that's somewhat of a lower resolution media versus, say, luster or glossy paper. But again, if you're using a print shop, consult them, and I'm sure they'll have a very precise method of deciding exactly what your image resolution should be for the media at a specific size.
And I'm not sure I'm going to read this question right, but you might know what I'm talking about. But how do you do soft proof gamut issue in Lightroom? Is that right?
Yeah. So
Okay.
the soft proof that we just did, we will go to Lightroom, and I have to share my screen or else it's just me narrating myself in Lightroom. So if you're in the develop module, you'll see down here below your image preview is a little checkbox for soft proofing. So you select that, and then over on the right side with all of your adjustment palettes at the top, it gives you two very succinct options. First is your profile, which is conveniently named profile here instead of device to simulate as it is in Photoshop. So profile, here we have Entrada Rag Natural for the P700, and then perceptual or relative rendering. You just click between the two. And then again, we have that simulate paper and ink checkbox, not my favorite. So you can toggle it on and off by checking soft proofing. And then if you want to see the gamut warning and some other things, I'll share the entire screen. You go up to view, soft proofing, and then destination gamut warning. And for Lightroom, it uses red for the destination gamut warning because the one other pretty cool thing we have in Lightroom, and I'm going to turn this off real quick, is the monitor gamut warning. So especially if you're working on a laptop or some other display that may have a smaller gamut, the monitor gamut warning will show you if there are colors in your image that you don't actually see one-to-one on your monitor. So this is a great tool that works both ways that is right now only available in Lightroom. They don't have a monitor gamut warning in Photoshop. So again, soft proof checkbox, and then over on the right, you choose your profile and your rendering intent, and then view menu, soft proofing. You can turn your monitor gamut warning on and off and your destination gamut warning on and off.
And I'm going to just turn my video on for asking the questions because it might be hard for some people to hear what I'm saying. But the next question, is there any difference printing in an image downloaded from the internet?
Yes, but that's not a simple answer to the question. So you'll notice that the link that we put in the chat for the printer evaluation image, you can download that as a 16-bit TIFF, which is the most data possible. There's a lot of versions of that image that you'll find, say if you do a Google image search for it, and a lot of those are 8-bit JPEGs in various sRGB or Adobe RGB. So those will be dramatically different in quality from the one from the original source, because a 16-bit file gives you tens of thousands of more potential shades of gray, and ProPhoto RGB gives you the largest gamut. So if you're looking for a test image on the internet, then you absolutely want, if you can find it, a 16-bit TIFF in Adobe RGB or ProPhoto RGB. Everything else is a downgrade from that in different ways, which also leads me to, if you're working in Lightroom and you're going to export files for print, or you're going to kind of save archive copies of a file that you've edited, you also want to save those as a 16-bit TIFF in ProPhoto RGB or Adobe RGB, because you're maximizing the amount of possible data in that file. You may not be pushing the boundaries of it if it's a simple portrait or a landscape without a lot of vibrant colors, but the biggest thing you're doing is you're not ever going to restrict the data in that file and end up losing any color information or shadow information or anything else like that. So yes, for test images, you absolutely want to find the highest resolution file you can.
Can you explain any differences between profiles in Adobe InDesign versus Adobe Photoshop driver for fine art and photo printing?
So InDesign is not created to be a photo printing software. I have talked with some folks that are doing books or proof projects or things like that. InDesign is really meant to be a layout software for traditional prepress or CMYK printing. So you have kind of limited options when you're printing from InDesign to an inkjet printer. So for photographs, you're best off printing out of photography software. If you're printing out spreads from InDesign, there's a specific set of settings you can use. And I would say for the person who's asking that, you're probably doing a project in InDesign, go ahead and email us and I can send you the notes on the settings to use and why you have to use them. But it's definitely not a straightforward process getting a good photograph printed out of an InDesign document.
I'm using a Datacolor Spider X Pro on my MacBook Pro. Do you have a recommendation for a separate photo monitor, and with the X Pro work with that?
So I talk about the BenQ monitors a lot because we've got a number of them here in the office, and they're relatively inexpensive for what you get. It's somewhere between say $700 and $1,000 for a 27, 28-inch Adobe RGB monitor. So they're very economical. And the step up from that would be something, say, from Azo, which is probably going to be about twice the price, although a lot of the Azos do include a built-in calibrator and some other features. So it's really what fits your budget, what size do you want, and what resolution are you looking for. I'm not sure about the Datacolor Spider product as a calibrator. I'm guessing it'll work, but a quick email or phone call to BenQ support, and they should be able to tell you exactly what monitor calibrators are compatible if there's not already a list on their website. So if you're getting a monitor specific for photography, I would absolutely recommend the 10-bit monitor with the 99% Adobe RGB. You'll see a noticeable difference in how your images are rendered, and especially the contrast range and the level of tonal detail in your files will be noticeably better than any standard monitor. And I can put a link to them, but no, go ahead.
I have an i1 Studio and an iMac. When calibrating, I'm always asked to adjust my white point. How do I adjust that?
Adjusting your white point on an iMac, I don't believe that you have any ability to do that. In calibrating the Mac laptops here, I haven't had it asked to adjust the white point. Sometimes it wants me to adjust the brightness manually, and I think that's the only metric you have on an Apple display that you can adjust. So if there's something that's got you stuck with an X-Rite calibrator, give them a call, and they should be able to walk you through if you need to change the setting, how to do it, or let you know that it's something that's adjusted for in the profile.
I haven't still used Color Monkey Photo to calibrate my iMac Pro monitor. Any need to change or upgrade?
As long as your calibration is still looking accurate, no reason to change your monitor calibrator. I've found that they seem to be pretty stable for, I'd say, 5 to 7 years. I had one that was getting pretty old and it was definitely trending pink the more times I would use it. So that's just the sensor itself falling out of calibration, but they should be good for many years, especially because you're only using it 10, 12, 8 times a year. And then the other times it's just sitting on the shelf.
Do you have any experience using Epson Eco Super Tank printers?
I don't, and we don't generally make profiles for those because they change them very quickly, and they're typically only 4-color printers. So if you have a Canon, what are they, TX or IP series printer, or you have one of the Epson Eco Tanks, those do ship with some color profiles built by Canon or Epson. And there's a page on our ICT profile page that we link to that says if we don't have profiles for your printer, click here. And it has recommendations for manufacturer media settings and profiles that work best with our papers on those more desktop home office printers.
So someone has an Epson P800 and it sat unused throughout 2020, 2021. Can she shake or replace cartridges to help the printer? I know that you're supposed to use your printer every now and then.
Yeah, so the best thing you can do is hopefully the machine was powered on. If not, that's okay too. The good thing is that when these machines do sit unused, they do cap the bottom of the head inside the printer, so that's going to help a lot. What I would do starting out is turn on the machine, run a nozzle check, see how it looks. If it's badly clogged, well, actually, I take that back. Before you turn on the machine, yes, take the cartridges out and don't shake them, but just gently kind of rock them back and forth. And what that does is that helps to sort of stir the pigments back up into suspension in the solution. So pop the tanks out, rock them gently back and forth 20 to 30 seconds. And this is a good exercise if you have a printer where the tanks are not in the print head, they're just mounted in the printer. If you're not changing the inks, more than every 6 months, it's good to pop them out and do a little agitation to kind of stir those pigment particles back up. So first, agitate your ink tanks. Second, turn it on, run a nozzle check, see how it looks. Do 1, maybe 2 head cleanings. I don't recommend the deep clean or the power clean or anything like that. So just do a couple of standard head cleanings. And then if it's improving a bit, but still not cleared out, what I would recommend doing is printing an 8.5, 11 page or two of, say, that test image that we linked to. And what that does is that just helps to force the ink out of the nozzles. Whereas when you do a head clean, it tries to kind of vacuum the ink out. So you're trying to purge it a couple different ways. And then often it helps after you've done a couple of head cleanings and a print or two to actually turn the printer off and then turn it back on again. And sometimes that can kind of reset things. I'm not 100% sure why, but it seems to work here sometimes when we get head clogs, and then kind of repeat that process. There will, come a point when you might say, well, I'm not quite sure if I want to, I've done a whole lot of cleanings and it's not reviving, but, maybe at that point, just letting it sit idle overnight or doing a couple of power cycles might help. But it's going to be a balance of some nozzle checks, head cleanings, and then just printing a few pages to see if that helps to force the clog channels to clear.
Can you suggest a varnish to protect Juniper Baryta rag if mounting without glazing?
So we don't have a product for it. Our desert varnish is really meant for matte papers and doesn't necessarily disappear completely on Baryta or other photo black papers. So there are some paint on or roll on products out there. I haven't used any of them with Juniper, but another good option is you can do a matte or a semi-matte laminate if you have a frame shop that can do like a vacuum press laminate, and that will seal the surface of the paper completely and retain the texture and the look. Obviously, you'll have to kind of test to see what product is the best fit for that. But generally for a photo paper, I recommend doing a laminate, whereas with a matte paper, you can use the desert varnish.
Are some papers more or less susceptible to high humidity and large changes in temperature?
Well, yes and no. The biggest difference is a cotton rag paper, say the Entrada, or even an alpha cellulose matte. It's the same on both sides. So if the paper is going to absorb some humidity, it's likely going to expand at an even rate. Whereas if you have a Baryta paper or one of our slick rock papers, and especially the Baryta, that's got the barium sulfate coating on one side of a cotton sheet. So if you have a Baryta paper that gets exposed to high humidity, likely the base sheet will expand at a different rate from the coating, and that can cause some rippling at the edge of the paper, depending on how it's mounted or adhered to backer board in a frame. So if you are framing your prints and you're doing just a hinge at the top and the rest is just laying in the frame under the mat, that should be all right. But again, if you have it in a really high humidity environment, you may get some rippling around the edge. Whereas if you vacuum mount that print to a backer board and then put it in a frame, you probably won't see any rippling in the print because you've firmly attached it to a very thick substrate that's going to have little humidity reaction no matter what the changes are. But to follow that up, if you have something framed, with glass and backer board, and then even a paper seal on the back of the frame, the humidity variation within the frame should be a lot less dramatic than the humidity variation outside the frame. So just a good framing job should counteract most of those humidity concerns before they even get to the print.
So now you have a lot of questions about leaving the power on in your printer. Do you always leave it on?
I always leave all of our printers on. A lot of the Canon printers will do kind of an ink agitation on a regular basis. A lot of the newer Epsons will do a nozzle check on a regular basis. And the other thing that it does is it makes sure that head stays properly capped and kind of ready for action, so to speak. So I never turn any of them off, and we rarely have head clogging problems. They're also in a pretty temperature and humidity stable environment. So I'm out in the Pacific Northwest. We don't have, really dry winters or really warm summers. One of the best things you can do is if you live in a lower humidity region, or you live in a place such as the upper Midwest that gets really cold in the winter, is if you have a printer, say, just sitting out, leave it on. And if you can, cover it in a heavy duty, trash bag. They make nice clear trash bags these days, so you don't just have a black trash bag sitting in your office. But if you cover it in a big piece of plastic and you put just a bucket of water underneath the printer on the floor, that water will naturally evaporate and add some humidity to that little environment you've created for the printer, and that should dramatically reduce nozzle clogging and other issues that you'll have when you fire it up. Now, in addition to leaving it on, I recommend printing something every couple of weeks. Just run a nozzle check, or print your grocery list or anything. You just want to kind of wake the printer up, get it moving a little bit, get a little bit of ink out of the head, and that'll just kind of keep it primed and ready to go for when you want to go print a photo and you have to spend a half an hour trying to clear up a head clog or anything else like that.
So someone is scanning a 4x5 transparency onto their computer at 350 DPI. How large can they enlarge it? Their client wants it up to 42 inches. Is that possible?
Why are you stuck scanning it at 350 DPI? That's the question. Because if you have a 4x5 and you scan it at 350, you don't have a lot of latitude to make that bigger, because if you double it in size, you're going to end up at 150 pixels an inch, which is getting pretty low. So especially when you're digitizing negatives or scanning anything, you want to scan it with your target print size in mind. So if I'm 4x5 and I want to print it 40 by 50, then I'm going to want it at a couple thousand DPI or more, so that when I go to enlarge it, I'm shooting for 200, 240 if possible, kind of 180 at the minimum at that size. So look at your final print and then work backwards as to what your resolution needs to be when you digitize that original.
Great. Is there a recommended way to deckle at the edge of a photo paper?
Yes, with a thin metal ruler. And let me grab one of those and we'll do a little demo.
But you can't do that with all papers, can you?
You wouldn't want to do it with a like a luster or Baryta would be a challenge. You're going to really do it generally with a cotton paper or a matte paper. What do we have here that we can tear up? Let's see. Nope, that's. So here's a print on Entrada. And so what you'll do is you'll want a few inches of extra space around the edge. So I wouldn't necessarily want to deckle this because it's got such a tight margin. But what you would do is you'd lay your print down, you'd put your ruler on top, and you'd want to obviously measure so that it's straight. But if you just hold the ruler down and then tear the paper along the ruler, you'll get that more kind of natural deckled edge. And the grain direction of the paper and also the length of the fibers and whether it's mold made or machine continuous made is going to determine how your deckle looks. Now, another thing that you could do if you want is you can experiment with, do I pull it from the front as I'm doing here? So you can get kind of a longer fray with no ink on it, or do you flip it over and deckle it, say from the back, in which case that kind of over tear, when you flip the print over, is going to show the ink on the image. There we go. So here we go. We've got the one that I deckled from the back has a real clean reveal with the image, whereas the one I deckled from the front has a lot more white showing. And lastly, you could, on the back of the sheet, if you kind of pencil in a line as to where let's give this something to focus on. There we go. So on the back of the sheet, if you're gonna deckle the edge and you can draw a little pencil line, you could take a Q-tip that's been dipped in water and kind of trace that line with the Q-tip to moisten the paper, and that's going to separate the fibers a little bit and give you an even different deckle. So a number of ways to do it. Again, if you have some scraps hanging around, give it a try. Get yourself a thin aluminum ruler. This one has a cork back, so it grips the paper really well, and tear away. But yeah, definitely a fun way to make a unique print out of a cotton or a matte paper. And I mean, go for it. If you have a Baryta and you want to see what happens, well, let's see what happens. This is the Juniper. So we'll try this from the back. And it's easier to tear than I thought. So the Juniper also makes a nice deckled edge. So there we go. Entrada, Juniper, both deckle nicely, both cotton papers. So you never know what we get to do on these webinars. Sure, let's tear up some prints. Let's see what happens.
Okay, so I'm just going to run through a few more of these. We don't have that many more questions, so I'll try to get through as many as we can. But going back to TIFF, will the print from TIFF match the print from Lightroom?
You're printing the TIFF from Lightroom, so need a little more clarification on that one. Yeah, sorry about that.
I'll look for clarification. Did you say that when calibrating a BenQ monitor, you should unplug the calibrator into the monitor, or you should plug the calibrator into the monitor?
Yes, you have to plug the calibrator directly into the USB port on the monitor and use the BenQ software in order to calibrate the hardware LUT in the monitor. If you plug the USB calibrator into your computer and or use, say, the X-Rite software, you're not doing the full 10-bit calibration. You're just doing a standard monitor calibration. You're kind of bypassing that hardware LUT that you paid more money for.
I use Lightroom for printing. When I use soft proofing, I have to mark for simulate paper and ink. If not, I do not see the differences between the different profiles. The only situation I have to uncheck it is when I use Slick Rock Metallic Pearl.
Okay, well, let's go back to Lightroom and minimize the Q&A. Okay, so we're in the develop module. We have soft proofing checked. And if we go to the view menu, soft proofing, you may need to turn show proof on and off. Because if I turn show proof off, well, I guess it deselects it. So that wasn't the answer. So for me, simulate paper and ink just lightens the image a little bit and changes the shadow rendition because it's a cotton rag profile. Now that'll be different if I go to the P800 because one was made with a polarizer and one was not. But even here, if I turn the proof on and off, I do see differences in the colors. So I'm guessing that that is just maybe a setting somewhere that's not quite selected right, because you shouldn't have to select simulate paper and ink in order to see the proof setup preview in Lightroom. Hopefully that helps.
Okay, we only have a few more questions. And this one, I don't know if we talked about it in the black and white webinar. I don't think we did, but let me know. Do you recommend scanning black and white, negative, and grayscale, or in color for printing in black and white?
You're going to want to do some testing on that, but generally, if you have the option for 16-bit grayscale, that can absolutely work. But if you want to do a lot of editing in Photoshop with it, you're probably best bringing it in as, say, a ProPhoto RGB in 16-bit, because that's going to let you use all those curve layers and other things to make adjustments. And you can also, I'm not 100% sure as to how the black and white sliders work with a image brought in from black and white, but I would say do some experimenting with that. Scan the same file a couple different ways and see in your editing workflow how that changes what you're able to do with the file and the visible results.
Okay, we only have 2 more questions, so I'm going to run through these quickly. I think you made everyone nervous with turning the printer off. So when I leave my Canon printer on, it turns itself off after a period of time. Is there a way that they can keep the printer on and not have it turn off?
Yes, so you do that in the printer utility. Let's see, I think we can do that really quick. So if you're on the Mac, it's System Preferences, Printers and Scanners. And then you select, we'll do the Pro 10. And you open the print queue, and then settings, and then utility, which is located somewhere else, but I don't remember where, so I always get to it this way. And then open printer utility. Now we can share the printer utility. Okay, so here is the Canon printer utility. You're going to go to power settings, and then auto power. And hopefully the Pro 10 is powered off. It is. So there's a little pull down menu here, and you can select disable and then hit OK. And then that will set your printer to not turn off by itself anymore. But again, there's no huge detriment to your printer turning off from time to time. It's not like you're going to break it if it turns off and it's going to live forever if it stays on. It's just in all of my testing and conversations that I have with other people, the running wisdom is to leave your printer powered on. So don't feel like you're doing mortal harm to it if it decides to take a little break and turn itself off.
Great. All right, so I think we'll end here. We actually do have one more question, so we'll quickly run through this. On a 5-year-old, I already forgot how to say this monitor.
ASO monitor should be plugged into the display. That would be a question for ASO. I'm going to assume so, but I haven't used ASO monitors, so check your documentation or give them a call. But generally, yes, if you're calibrating a monitor with a hardware LUT, you want to plug the monitor calibrator into the monitor and use the display manufacturer's calibration software and not the software that came with your monitor calibrator.
Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you hopefully at the next webinar.
We'll do it again soon.
Yeah.